In the 1880s in this country, the ordinary working man was, for the first time, given the vote. And what's extraordinary is that in the elections that followed, notably the Midlothian campaign, some of the campaigns between Disraeli and Gladstone, campaigns of the 1880s, the early 20th century leading up to the so-called khaki election, foreign policy played an absolutely central role in many of those campaigns. Some really quite complex issues, policy towards the Ottoman Empire, the Eastern question, were pretty central to those campaigns. There was no sense that the enfranchised working man was somehow unenlightened and incapable of being involved in the decision-making process. On the contrary, those campaigns were typically, between Gladstone and Disraeli, a contest of competing visions of British foreign policy. And the working man with the vote was expected to make a choice as to what policy the government they were electing should engage in. The point I'm trying to make is that for a long time in this country, the people who govern us assumed that ordinary people could be involved in the foreign policy conversation. Contrast that to the world today. I would suggest that, on the contrary, we now have a situation where smug, technocratic, managerialist elites who believe that they're more enlightened than the people whose tax dollars they spend, believe that they have a unique wisdom. And I think what we see in response is a reaction against this. And I think it is a legitimate and justifiable reaction. We hear many people complain that somehow populists are not sufficiently critical of Putin. I happen to think Putin's a dreadful man. I happen to think his regime is a barbaric tyranny. But when was the last time I heard David Cameron or a leader of the Free West explaining quite how serious it is when Russian-backed militiamen shoot down planes over Ukraine? You simply don't get that attempt by the elites to explain what is at stake. Look back, look at the situation today with Ukraine. Compare the clarity with which Margaret Thatcher explained why Slobodan Milosevic was an evil tyrant and should one day face justice in the territories where he was committing atrocities. I remember as a young student listening to Margaret Thatcher saying one day this man Milosevic will have to face justice, and indeed he did. I think he died in prison. Where is that clarity from Western leaders explaining who the bad guys are? The migration crisis. I remember John Major very clearly explaining why the West had a duty to impose no-fly zones in northern Iraq. I can't remember a Western leader explaining good, bad, in whose interest we should act with that simplicity and that clarity. We complain, well, amongst the sort of people who read The Economist and the FT and watch Newsnight, we complain that the populists are somehow critical of Western interventionism. Okay, but who in Washington or Downing Street or the Elysee Palace really thought through the Libyan adventurism? I think there's this tendency for those of us who think about politics all the time to assume that the demos is somehow unenlightened. I think actually we should ask what it is about the failures of elites that accounts for some of this behavior. There's, I'm not going to rehearse the arguments, but when any attempt is made to analyze insurgents, there's always an easy, off-the-shelf explanation that they're angry nativists who are frustrated with modernity and don't like the modern world and they're somehow losers. I profoundly and fundamentally disagree with that analysis. I think those of us who put together the Vote Leave campaign as early as 2011, 2012 were doing empirical research to show, which showed us and convinced us very clearly that in order to win a majority, Vote Leave should not major on migration. Thankfully, in the tussle for designation that followed, our side won, and we therefore ran a campaign that actually didn't prioritise and focus primarily on migration. And I would put it to you that that is why we won. We would have won 60-40 if we had been allowed to make that case uncluttered by others who were trying to bring immigration into the equation at every opportunity. We would have lost 60-40 if the other side had got designation. The reason why there is a political insurgency, I think, is it's not a rejection of modernity. On the contrary, modernity makes it possible. Many of these guys who you hear get airtime because technology allows them to. 20, 30 years ago, the ability of an insurgent party to communicate its message, it simply wasn't there. Trump got a lot of airtime in the United States because of Fox News. He can get the coverage because the stations, the TV stations, will cover him. Many insurgent parties in this country, Frau Petri in Germany, Beppe Grillo, I think he has several million followers on Facebook and Twitter. Social media allows them to communicate. So far from being a rejection of modernity, modernity actually allows niches in politics to get some time. Chris Anderson wrote a book called The Long Tail a few years ago, 10 years ago, ostensibly about how the internet was going to change retail and allow endless choice and competition. Exactly that is happening to politics. A second reason why we're seeing many of these insurgents, and I think this is, I'm not going to touch every subject because, you know, if you read the mainstream newspapers, you'll get the orthodox analysis. But insufficient attention has been paid to the impacts of monetary policy. You hear a lot on the far left, Mason and Corbyn talking about inequality. Actually, in terms of income inequality stopped growing in most Western states in the early 1990s. In fact, I would argue globalization has narrowed income inequality by allowing people to live more cheaply. But there is nonetheless an inequality caused by monetary policy, and that is the difference between asset wealth and wage wealth. And I don't think that can be ignored any longer as a factor that certainly in Britain, and I would say in some other Western states is driving this feeling of injustice. Just I'll put it out this way. There are in London 5 boroughs where if you had gone to work every day since 1997 and earned an average wage, you would have earned more money simply by owning a bricks and mortar property in that borough than by anything you could have earned since 1997. People who don't own bricks and mortar are feeling the pinch. Thirdly, you know, since when did the people give their consent to have the West organised by sort of pan-continental federations with small groups of technocrats in Washington or Brussels making key decisions? Many people, the sort of people who attend Davos summits, think that this is the best way to organise the lives of tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people. But I don't think that the demos quite agrees. This arrogant idea that Europe should be organised and to some extent the United States should become a continental federation governed by unaccountable technocrats. You know, quite rightly, the people aren't gonna wear that. They're not wearing it in the United States, and they're not going to wear it in Western Europe. I really don't think that the West should be organised by the grand projects of the economist FT reading elite. Often the sorts of elites who decide public policy from the comfort of Brussels happen to actually get it pretty hideously and catastrophically wrong, and the public correctly recognises. Much of the insurgency that we're seeing is a response to the fact that politics in many states is a cartel. The rules are rigged. In continental Europe, it's often the electoral system itself that is rigged. In this country, the political system is a cartel that is rigged for the convenience of the 2.5-party establishment. Everything from public funding of political parties. We pretend we don't use public money to fund parties. We do to a vast extent. There is a political cartel. All political cartels end up ripping off the customer. That's what political cartels in many Western states do. Unsurprisingly, people are shopping around for something that is going to break open the cartel. The final thought I would have is why is it that we're seeing insurgents wanting direct democracy? The use, for example, of the referendum and other devices, the call for open primaries, recall. When Dan Hannan and I wrote a book called Direct Democracy, an Agenda for a New Model Party about 10 or 15 years ago, we having looked at many state institutions in this country, it seemed clear to us that actually what Antonio Gramsci had forecast all those years ago was coming to pass. There was this long march through the institutions of a sort of leftist mindset where, you know, so many institutions of the state were in the hands of small elites whose public policy priorities owed more to the thinking on university sociology campuses in the 1970s than what people in Essex or London or the Midlands wanted. So the way to recalibrate things was to make the institutions of the state more directly democratically accountable. King Charles Street is aghast at the fact that people have voted to leave the European Union, but I would say the referendum is actually quite a good way of recalibrating our foreign policy priorities. It's not really for career diplomats in this country to decide British foreign policy, it's surely for the country to decide British foreign policy. So, in all sorts of ways, I think we need to ensure that the institutions of the state, whether it's the justice system or the foreign policy makers or central bankers, are made more accountable to the rest of us. I don't see this fundamentally as the customer's fault. When the customer is angry and dissatisfied with shoddy service, it's actually a reflection of the politics providers. We have pretty rubbish politics providers. We mustn't, I think, make the mistake of assuming that all insurgents are the same. As the internet comes along and it allows all sorts of rather peculiar organizations to come along and offer themselves for public office, please don't make the mistake of assuming that my party has much in common with the insurgents in France. But however critical one is of some of the insurgents, you're going to get these snake oil salesmen and charlatans if the alternative is Ed Miliband type consensus Labour Party opposition to David Cameron type patrician Toryism. If the alternatives are big state republicanism versus big state Democrats in the United States, well, Bernie Sanders and Trump will be the future. I wouldn't blame the customer for the way that they, in my view, the customer is always right. The reason why we see these insurgent parties is because the mainstream parties are pretty lazy, pretty grubby, and pretty out of touch.